Do not let her touch that engine. Richard Collins's voice cracked across the innovation garage like a steel cable snapping under pressure. A wave of laughter rolled through the room as every head turned toward the black woman standing quietly beside the prototype. Ava Brooks did not move. Her grease-stained gloves rested against her thighs. The polished concrete floor reflected the harsh white lights overhead, while the smell of hot aluminum, motor oil, and burnt wiring hung thick in the air. Behind the glass walls, investors waited with folded arms. Television crews adjusted their cameras. A digital clock above the launch stage counted down from 12 minutes and 46 seconds. Every second echoed louder than the last. Richard looked her up and down with an amused smile. This is a $50 million prototype, not somebody's neighborhood repair shop. Several engineers laughed harder. One whispered, "She probably came to clean up the mess." Another shook his head. "Wrong uniform. Wrong place." Ava lowered her eyes for only a moment, not from shame but to study the small puddle of coolant beneath the chassis. Something about its color bothered her. She could hear the engine ticking softly as trapped heat escaped through the metal. Tick. 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 The sound was uneven. Her fingers tightened around the worn wrench clipped to her belt. Richard stepped closer, expensive leather shoes stopping inches from the stain on the floor. "Security," he called without taking his eyes off her. "Escort her back to maintenance before she damages something valuable." Heavy footsteps echoed from the far side of the garage. Two security officers started walking toward Ava. Around them, executives in tailored suits exchanged confident smiles, already preparing excuses for a failed launch that threatened contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The giant display screen behind the prototype flashed the same warning again. Engine failure. System offline. Restart unsuccessful. The words glowed bright red across the polished metal, reflecting in every anxious face except Ava's. She remained strangely calm. Her eyes drifted beneath the engine bay, tracing invisible lines no one else seemed to notice. Richard folded his arms. "The best engineers in America have spent 6 hours on that machine," he said. "What exactly do you think you can do?" Ava finally looked up. Her voice was steady, almost quiet enough to disappear beneath the hum of cooling fans. "They are looking at the computer." Richard laughed. "And?" She glanced back toward the prototype. "I am listening to the engine." Another burst of laughter rippled through the garage. Someone actually applauded sarcastically. One investor rolled his eyes and checked his watch. Outside the glass wall, reporters pointed cameras toward the growing commotion instead of the stage. The countdown reached 10 minutes. Richard shook his head as if disappointed by her audacity. "Confidence is admirable," he said coldly. "Delusion is expensive." Ava never answered. She took one slow step toward the disabled machine. Security closed in from both sides. The polished wrench hanging from her belt caught a beam of white light, flashing for the briefest instant. Then something almost impossible happened. Beneath the silence, beneath the laughter, beneath the constant ticking of cooling metal, Ava heard a faint metallic click. Just one. Tiny. Almost invisible beneath the noise. Her breathing stopped. Her eyes widened only slightly. She knew that sound. She had heard it years ago beside her father's rusted pickup truck on a humid summer afternoon. The memory hit her like electricity. Richard noticed her expression and smirked. "Too late," he said. "You already missed your chance." Ava slowly lifted her gaze toward the engine, no longer looking uncertain. She was looking certain. And that frightened her far more than the laughter ever could. Ava did not blink. The faint metallic click echoed again, buried beneath the steady hum of cooling fans. It was almost too soft to exist, yet it cut through every other sound in the garage. Her heartbeat slowed instead of racing. She knew that rhythm. She had spent years listening to machines everyone else had given up on. Richard Collins caught the change in her expression and smiled with open disbelief. "You still think you can save it?" His polished shoes scraped across the concrete as he stepped directly into her path. The overhead lights reflected off the prototype's silver body, throwing cold streaks across Ava's face. She never looked at him. Her eyes stayed locked on the engine compartment. "Move," she said quietly. Richard laughed. "That is not how this works." Around them, dozens of engineers stood with crossed arms. Some shook their heads. Others lifted their phones, already expecting another embarrassing moment. Beyond the glass wall, investors whispered while the countdown dropped below 9 minutes. Every red number seemed to pulse like a warning heartbeat. One senior engineer cleared his throat. "Sir, we have already replaced every sensor, every ignition module, every control board." Richard nodded confidently. "Exactly. There is nothing left to check." Ava finally spoke without raising her voice. "You replaced parts." A brief silence settled over the room. "You never asked why they failed." A few faces shifted. One younger engineer frowned at the coolant stain near the front wheel. Richard noticed the hesitation and quickly cut it off. "Enough." He turned toward security. "Remove her." The officers stepped forward again. Heavy boots echoed through the garage. Ava slowly crouched beside the prototype before anyone reached her. She extended one grease-marked finger beneath the engine cradle, stopping just short of a narrow braided cable hidden behind a polished heat shield. Her fingertips hovered without touching it. "There," she whispered. Several engineers leaned forward despite themselves. Richard folded his arms tighter. "There is nothing there." Ava looked up for the first time. "Exactly?" Confusion rippled through the crowd. One mechanic walked closer and aimed a flashlight into the opening. The bright beam disappeared beneath layers of polished aluminum before catching something unexpected. His face changed instantly. "Wait," he muttered. The garage grew so quiet that the ticking metal sounded impossibly loud. "The grounding strap," the mechanic whispered. "It is missing." Richard frowned. "Impossible." Another engineer hurried over with a second light. Both beams crossed beneath the chassis. Every eye followed them. The empty mounting bracket reflected back like a silent accusation. Nobody spoke. The missing strap was smaller than a ruler, cheaper than a restaurant dinner, yet without it the entire electrical system could never stabilize. Richard's confidence faltered for the first time. "Who inspected final assembly?" he demanded. No one answered. The lead engineer slowly lowered his tablet. Sweat glistened across his forehead despite the cool air pouring from the ceiling vents. "My team signed off on it," he admitted. Ava rose to her feet. Oil shimmered across her gloves beneath the white lights. She looked toward the storage cabinet against the far wall. "There is a replacement cable in Bay 7. Richard stared at her. "How could you possibly know that?" Ava hesitated for one quiet breath. "Because I put it there yesterday." Every conversation stopped. Even the cooling fans suddenly seemed distant. Richard's smile disappeared completely. His eyes narrowed as an unsettling realization settled over him. If she had been here yesterday, then she might know exactly why the engine had failed before anyone else did. Ava did not take her eyes off Richard Collins. Around them, the garage seemed to contract into a single breath. The polished steel of the prototype reflected the harsh white ceiling lights while the countdown clock slipped lower, each glowing red number pressing harder against every person in the room. The missing grounding strap lay in the engineer's hand, but Ava was no longer looking at it. She was listening. A faint metallic pulse echoed beneath the cooling fans. Tick. Pause. Tick. It was subtle, uneven, almost buried beneath the mechanical noise, yet her expression shifted with quiet certainty. Richard noticed it immediately. "You think you found something else?" he asked, folding his arms tighter. "I know I did," Ava replied. A few engineers exchanged skeptical glances. One quietly laughed. "She keeps guessing, and somehow everyone keeps listening." Richard gestured toward the prototype. "Go ahead," he said. "One more theory." Ava stepped closer, her work boots clicking softly across the polished concrete. Heat drifted from the open engine bay, carrying the scent of aluminum, coolant, and warm insulation. She leaned toward the exposed assembly but never reached inside. Instead, she closed her eyes for a brief moment. The room watched in complete silence. "She is listening?" one investor whispered behind the glass. "To what?" Another shrugged. "Apparently something our engineers cannot hear." Ava opened her eyes. "The engine is not failing," she said quietly. Richard frowned. "It has been dead for 6 hours. The engine is healthy," Ava answered. "Something is preventing it from trusting its own signals." The lead engineer looked puzzled. "That does not make sense." Ava pointed toward the lower harness beneath the intake assembly. "You replaced sensors because the computer told you they were failing." He nodded. "Yes." "Did you ever ask why every sensor failed at the same time?" No one answered. The question settled over the garage like a weight. Richard looked toward his engineering team. Their silence spoke louder than any report. One younger technician slowly crouched beside the prototype and followed Ava's line of sight with a flashlight. His beam caught an unusual abrasion hidden behind a protective panel. "Sir," he whispered, "there is fresh damage here." Richard stepped closer. "From assembly?" The technician swallowed. "No. This happened after production." The garage fell silent again. Camera phones rose throughout the observation gallery. Ava's breathing remained calm. "Someone wanted you to believe the engine had multiple failures," she said. "They created a problem that looked expensive." Richard's confidence wavered for the first time. "Why?" Ava met his eyes. "Because no one questions complicated failures. They question simple ones." The lead engineer carefully removed the protective panel. Beneath it, a narrow section of wiring had been stripped with remarkable precision. Not torn. Not worn. Cut cleanly. "That is impossible," someone whispered. Richard stared at the exposed wiring, then slowly turned back toward Ava. The woman he had dismissed as maintenance now stood quietly beside the very machine his experts had failed to understand. Before he could speak, a faint electronic chime echoed from inside the cockpit. Every head snapped toward the dashboard. Without anyone touching the controls, one display flickered to life, bathing the cabin in an eerie blue glow. A single unfamiliar icon appeared at the center of the screen, pulsing once, then a second time. Ava's expression hardened. "That," she said softly, "does not belong to this car." Ava held Richard Collins's stare without flinching. The silence pressing against the garage felt heavier than the heat rising from the disabled engine. Camera shutters clicked beyond the glass wall, and whispered conversations spread through the crowd like a slow-moving current. Richard's jaw tightened. "Yesterday?" he asked, his voice lower now. "You were never assigned to this project." Ava nodded once. "I was assigned to maintenance." She looked toward the polished prototype. "Maintenance lets you notice what everyone else walks past." A nervous laugh escaped from one of the executives, but it died almost instantly. The countdown clock dropped below 7 minutes. Bright red numbers reflected across the chrome bodywork like warning lights. Richard motioned toward the lead engineer. "Tell her she is wrong." The engineer hesitated. His tablet trembled slightly in his hands. "The bracket is empty," he admitted quietly. "She is right about that." A ripple of unease moved across the room. Investors exchanged uncertain glances. Reporters shifted their lenses away from the stage and toward Ava instead. She took one careful step closer to the engine, stopping just outside the yellow safety line. Warm air drifted from the open compartment, carrying the sharp scent of heated metal and electrical insulation. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, listening again. Tick. 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 Then another sound emerged, almost hidden beneath the cooling fans. A faint vibration. Uneven. Out of rhythm. Her eyes opened immediately. "Do not install the new strap yet," she said. Richard stared at her in disbelief. "First you say it is missing. Now you say not to replace it? Ava's expression never changed. Because the missing strap is not the reason it failed. The room froze. Even the engineers nearest the prototype stopped moving. The lead engineer slowly lowered the replacement cable he had just retrieved. Richard's patience finally cracked. Enough games. His voice echoed off the concrete walls. We are minutes away from losing the largest contract this company has ever negotiated. Ava met his anger with calm certainty. If you install that strap now, the engine might start. Richard leaned forward. Then we are done. She shook her head. For about 30 seconds. The words landed harder than anyone expected. A murmur spread through the garage. One investor instinctively stepped back from the glass. Another looked toward the emergency exits. Richard's confidence flickered. Explain. Ava slowly pointed toward the lower section of the engine block. Someone rerouted the main harness. The missing strap distracted everyone from the real problem. The lead engineer hurried underneath the chassis with a flashlight. Seconds later, his breathing caught. Sir? His voice sounded distant. The insulation has been cut. Richard frowned. Manufacturing defect? The engineer swallowed hard. No. He looked up, his face drained of color. It was cut cleanly. With a blade. Every conversation stopped. The cooling fans hummed overhead. A phone slipped from someone's hand and struck the concrete with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent garage. Richard slowly turned toward his engineering team, searching one face after another. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Ava remained exactly where she was, her eyes fixed on the damaged wiring hidden beneath the polished shell. She was no longer looking at a mechanical failure. She was looking at intent. Richard followed her gaze, and for the first time since the crisis began, fear replaced pride in his eyes. Then the lead engineer reached deeper into the engine bay, pulled out a tiny black device taped behind the harness, and whispered words that left the entire garage standing perfectly still. This does not belong to our car. The small black device rested in the engineer's trembling hand. Under the bright garage lights, its matte casing looked strangely ordinary, yet every conversation in the room died at once. Richard Collins stepped forward, his polished shoes striking the concrete with sharp, measured echoes. What is it? He demanded. No one answered immediately. The lead engineer turned the object over carefully, revealing a thin antenna hidden beneath a strip of industrial tape. His face lost what little color remained. This was installed after production, he said quietly. It is not part of our design. A wave of uneasy whispers spread through the investors gathered behind the glass. Several reporters lifted their cameras higher, capturing every expression. Ava Brooks never took her eyes off the engine. The uneven vibration was still there, faint but persistent, pulsing through the steel frame like a heartbeat refusing to settle. Richard pointed toward her without looking away from the device. Did you know about this? Every face in the garage turned toward Ava. The silence felt heavier than the engine itself. She answered without hesitation. I knew something did not belong. I did not know what. Richard's expression hardened. Convenient. His voice echoed through the building. You appear out of nowhere, you know where the missing cable is, and now you somehow predict hidden sabotage? The accusation lingered in the air. Even some of the engineers looked uncertain. Ava could feel dozens of eyes searching her face for fear, guilt, or hesitation. They found none. Instead, she slowly walked toward the prototype, stopping just outside the open engine bay. Heat shimmered above the exposed metal. The scent of hot wiring mixed with coolant and machine oil, filling every breath. She reached toward the frame but stopped before making contact. Listen, she said softly. Nobody moved. Beneath the hum of ventilation fans, another sound emerged. Click. Pause. Click. Longer pause. It was subtle, but now everyone heard it. One of the younger mechanics frowned. That rhythm changed. Ava nodded once. Because the system is still receiving commands. Richard looked sharply at the engineer holding the black device. It is disconnected. Yes, Ava replied. But something else is not. The words sent another ripple through the room. The countdown clock slipped below 5 minutes. Bright red numbers reflected across the polished hood like warning lights. Investors exchanged anxious glances. A television producer whispered urgently into a headset. Richard rubbed a hand across his forehead. For the first time, frustration outweighed confidence. Find it, he ordered. Engineers rushed around the prototype with flashlights and inspection mirrors. Toolboxes opened. Panels came loose. Every passing second increased the pressure. Yet the mysterious clicking continued with perfect patience. Ava remained perfectly still. Then her gaze settled on the dashboard display inside the cockpit. Unlike everyone else, she was not looking at the engine. She was looking at the steering column. Her breathing slowed. Stop searching under the hood, she said. Nobody listened. Richard's voice cut across the garage. Keep going. Ava spoke again, louder this time. The engine is not talking to itself. Several engineers paused. Richard did not. We are wasting time because of another guess. Ava finally turned toward him. Her eyes were calm, but unmistakably certain. No, she said. You are wasting time because you are looking where you expect the problem to be. Before anyone could respond, a sharp electronic tone pierced the garage. Every display screen flickered at the same instant. The prototype's dashboard illuminated by itself. A single line of text appeared across the center display. No one had touched the controls. The message contained only 3 words, and as the room stared in stunned silence, Richard felt the ground shift beneath everything he thought he understood. Remote control active. The words remote control active remained frozen across the dashboard, bathing the cockpit in a cold blue glow. No one spoke. The steady buzz of the overhead lights suddenly felt louder than the crowd that had filled the garage only moments before. A camera shutter clicked somewhere behind the glass wall, then another. Richard Collins stared at the display as though it had rewritten reality in front of him. His breathing grew slower, heavier. The confidence that had carried him through every boardroom and product launch was slipping away one quiet second at a time. Ava Brooks remained exactly where she stood. The warmth rising from the engine brushed against her face while the faint smell of scorched insulation lingered in the still air. She watched the dashboard instead of the people around her. The message itself did not surprise her. What unsettled her was the timing. Someone had wanted the system to reveal itself only after they had found the hidden device. A vibration echoed through the steering column, so soft that only someone standing close could notice it. Ava tilted her head slightly. Richard finally found his voice. Can anyone explain this? The engineers exchanged uncertain glances. No one answered. One senior technician slowly removed his company badge and slipped it into his pocket as if it suddenly carried more weight than before. The countdown clock continued its silent march. 4 minutes. The red numbers reflected across polished steel, across nervous faces, across the expensive shoes of investors who no longer looked certain about anything. A telephone buzzed softly inside someone's jacket, but the call went unanswered. Ava stepped toward the driver's side door. Every movement was deliberate. Every footstep echoed through the quiet garage. Richard instinctively reached out. Do not touch it. She stopped, not because of his order, but because she had already noticed something else. The driver's seat had shifted forward by less than an inch. Barely visible. Impossible to notice unless someone had memorized the cabin during maintenance. Her eyes narrowed. Someone has been inside after final inspection, she said calmly. The lead engineer looked at the seat rails, then slowly nodded. She is right. His voice carried none of its earlier certainty. Richard looked from the seat to Ava, then back again. For the first time, he was no longer searching for flaws in her judgment. He was searching for answers she might already possess. The room felt different now. No one laughed. No one whispered about the mechanic from maintenance. The investors watched her instead of him. Reporters lowered their microphones, sensing that the most important moment required silence rather than commentary. Ava rested one grease-stained hand against the edge of the open door without climbing inside. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, listening once more. Not to the engine. Not to the cooling fans. To the rhythm beneath them. Then she opened her eyes and looked directly at Richard. "This prototype was never meant to fail," she said quietly. "It was meant to fail here." The words settled over the garage like a cold wind. Richard felt the meaning before he understood it. If she was right, the sabotage had never been about destroying a machine. It had been about destroying a public launch, a reputation, and perhaps an entire company in front of the world. The silence deepened. Somewhere beyond the glass, a news helicopter drifted overhead, its distant blades barely audible. Ava's gaze fell to a tiny green indicator glowing beneath the dashboard, almost hidden in shadow. It blinked once. Then again. Her expression changed for the first time that day. It was not fear. It was recognition. She whispered only 4 words, almost too softly for anyone else to hear. "They are still watching." The words lingered in the air. "They are still watching." Every face in the garage turned instinctively toward the towering glass walls, but beyond them there was only a sea of cameras, anxious investors, and flashing red lights from the broadcast trucks outside. The prototype remained perfectly still, its engine ticking softly as waves of heat shimmered above the polished metal. Richard Collins swallowed hard. For the first time that morning, he no longer looked like the man in charge. He looked like a man searching for solid ground beneath his feet. Ava Brooks slowly stepped into the driver's doorway, her movements measured and calm. She did not reach for the ignition. Instead, she looked beneath the steering column where the faint green light continued blinking at a steady interval. 3 seconds, she whispered. Then 5. One of the engineers frowned. "That is not random." Ava nodded. "No. It is waiting for confirmation." The room fell silent again. Phones continued recording, their tiny lenses reflecting the cold white lights hanging above the garage floor. Richard stared at her. "You have seen this before?" Ava did not answer immediately. Her fingertips hovered inches from the dashboard without touching it. "Not this system," she said quietly. "But the pattern." The lead engineer looked up from his tablet. "She is right. The signal repeats every 8 seconds. Richard's eyes shifted between the dashboard and Ava. "Can you stop it?" She took a slow breath. "Only if I stop treating this like a mechanical failure." The words landed with unexpected force. Every expert in the room had spent hours replacing components, testing circuits, and rebuilding assemblies. None of them had questioned the assumption that the engine itself was the problem. Ava looked instead toward the communication module tucked behind the center console. "The car is healthy," she said. "Someone keeps telling it not to trust itself." A ripple of disbelief swept through the engineers. One by one, expressions changed from skepticism to reluctant curiosity. The youngest technician suddenly looked toward the wireless diagnostics antenna mounted near the ceiling. "Disconnect the external network," he blurted. Richard hesitated. "If we do that, we lose the live demonstration." Ava finally looked directly at him. Her eyes were steady, almost compassionate. "If you do not, you lose much more." Richard stood motionless. Around him, investors watched without speaking. Just an hour earlier they had waited for him to dismiss the woman from maintenance. Now every one of them waited for his decision instead. His shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly. "Disconnect it," he said. The order echoed across the garage. An engineer rushed toward the communications cabinet and pulled the network link free. The soft blinking beneath the dashboard stopped instantly. A deep stillness settled over the prototype. Even the cooling fans seemed quieter. Ava leaned inside the cockpit and pressed a sequence of controls with calm precision. No hesitation. No wasted movement. Every eye followed her hands. Richard could hear his own heartbeat beneath the silence. The ignition display awakened. System checks rolled across the screen one after another. Green. 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 Then, for the first time all day, the warning messages disappeared. The engine started with a smooth, confident rumble that filled the garage with warm mechanical life instead of panic. Nobody cheered. Nobody moved. They simply stared. The impossible had happened in complete silence. Richard looked at Ava, unable to hide the regret spreading across his face. The laughter from earlier that morning echoed painfully in his memory. Before he could speak, a security officer hurried through the crowd holding a tablet. His expression was pale. "Mr. Collins," he said carefully, "security just reviewed the overnight footage." Richard turned slowly. "And?" The officer looked from Richard to Ava before answering. "The person who entered this garage last night was wearing one of our executive access badges." The garage remained silent long after the security officer lowered the tablet. The engine purred with calm, steady confidence, its soft vibration replacing the panic that had consumed the room only minutes earlier. Richard Collins stared at the screen showing the overnight footage. A shadowed figure wearing an executive access badge moved through the garage with deliberate precision, disappearing behind the prototype before the recording abruptly ended. No one spoke. The only sound was the gentle hum of machinery and the distant clicking of camera shutters beyond the glass wall. Richard slowly looked toward Ava Brooks. She stood beside the open driver's door, wiping a thin streak of grease from her fingertips with a worn shop towel. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply watched the engine run exactly as it had been designed to. The heat rising from the polished aluminum softened the cold light falling across her face, while the crowd that had mocked her only an hour before now watched in complete silence. One investor lowered his phone. Another quietly removed his glasses, rubbing a hand across tired eyes as though trying to understand how they had all missed what she had seen almost immediately. The lead engineer stepped forward first. His shoulders, once rigid with certainty, now seemed noticeably smaller. "Miss Brooks," he said carefully, "I owe you an apology." Ava met his eyes with quiet respect. "You do not owe me one," she replied. "You owe the truth one." The words settled gently across the room. There was no accusation in her voice, only honesty. Several engineers exchanged uneasy glances. One by one, they began looking less at the engine and more at the woman standing beside it. Richard remained motionless. Every memory from that morning returned with painful clarity. The laughter. The dismissive remarks. His order to have her escorted away. He heard them now as though someone else had spoken them. They sounded smaller than he remembered. He took 2 slow steps toward Ava. The polished concrete echoed beneath each footstep. When he finally stopped in front of her, the distance between them felt far greater than a few feet. "I judged you before I listened," he said quietly. His voice no longer carried the commanding certainty that had filled the garage earlier. It carried something unfamiliar. Regret. Ava looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You judged my uniform," she said softly. "Not my work." Richard lowered his eyes. Around them, cameras continued recording, but no one interrupted. The moment belonged to neither headlines nor investors. It belonged to the quiet weight of recognition. The lead engineer removed the visitor badge from Ava's coveralls and looked at it for a brief second before handing it back with both hands instead of one. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, yet everyone noticed. Respect had replaced assumption without anyone announcing it. Beyond the glass wall, several investors began applauding. The sound spread slowly rather than all at once, hesitant at first, then genuine. It was not applause for a successful engine. It was for the courage to speak when no one wanted to listen. Ava acknowledged them with a simple nod before turning back toward the prototype. Her fingertips rested lightly against the warm edge of the hood. "She deserves the credit," she said quietly. Richard looked puzzled. "The car?" Ava smiled faintly. "No. The team that built it. They created something remarkable. Someone else tried to make them doubt it. Those words settled over the engineers like a quiet invitation to stand together instead of apart. For the first time that day, they gathered around the prototype as one group rather than separate ranks divided by titles and assumptions. Then the security officer's radio crackled sharply, breaking the calm. His expression changed as he listened. The color drained from his face. He looked toward Richard, then toward Ava. "Sir," he said almost in a whisper, "we just identified whose executive badge was used." Richard felt his heartbeat quicken again. The garage, only moments ago beginning to breathe again, fell back into complete silence. The security officer lowered the radio slowly. No one asked the name. They could already see the answer in his face. The investigation would continue, but the truth no longer belonged to rumors. It belonged to evidence. The prototype continued to idle with a quiet, confident rhythm, its steady vibration replacing the chaos that had filled the garage only an hour before. The overhead lights reflected softly across the silver bodywork, no longer harsh, only still. Richard Collins looked around the room. The investors were no longer watching him. Their attention rested on Ava Brooks. Reporters lowered their cameras, sensing that the loudest moment of the day had already passed. What remained could not be captured by headlines alone. Richard walked toward Ava one final time. His footsteps echoed gently across the concrete floor, each one sounding less like authority and more like humility. He stopped beside the open hood instead of in front of her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The warmth from the engine drifted upward between them before slowly fading into the cool afternoon air. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and removed the executive access badge clipped inside. He looked at it for a second, then quietly placed it on the edge of the workbench beside Ava's worn wrench. "I spent years believing titles earned respect," he said softly. "Today I learned respect has to be earned before the title means anything." Ava glanced at the badge but made no move to pick it up. Instead, she carefully folded the grease-stained shop towel she had been holding and placed it beside her toolbox. "Machines do not care who signs the paycheck," she replied. "They only respond to the person willing to understand them." Richard nodded slowly. There was no defense left to offer. Only acceptance. Around them, the engineers gathered closer to the prototype. The lead engineer extended a hand toward Ava. This time there was no hesitation in the gesture, no trace of doubt. She accepted the handshake with the same calm dignity she had carried from the beginning. One by one, the others followed. No speeches. No applause. Just quiet respect replacing quiet prejudice. Beyond the glass wall, the first rays of late afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds, washing the garage in a softer light that shimmered across polished steel and oil-marked concrete alike. The prototype no longer looked like the center of a crisis. It looked like the work of many hands finally seen for what it truly was. Ava picked up her old wrench and slid it back into the worn loop on her belt. She closed the hood with a gentle push. The solid click echoed through the garage like the final page of a long story. She turned toward the exit, her boots leaving faint prints across the concrete where drops of coolant still glistened beneath the fading light. No one asked her to stop. No one questioned whether she belonged there. Richard watched her walk toward the open bay door until she reached the sunlight. Just before stepping outside, Ava paused and looked back at the garage one last time. Her eyes moved across the engineers, the investors, the cameras, and finally to Richard. She offered nothing more than a small, genuine smile before walking into the evening. The engine continued to run behind her with a smooth, steady hum. Richard remained where he was, listening to that sound until it became impossible to separate it from the lesson it had carried all along. Some people prove their worth by speaking the loudest. Others simply fix what everyone else was too certain to understand. And long after the voices had faded, the only thing left filling the garage was the quiet confidence of an engine that had finally been heard.